Fantastic. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Confabulating. It's our great pleasure to be joined this evening by Professor GIORA STERNBERG of Hertford College, Oxford, who will be speaking on the subject of status of interaction in the reign of Louis XIV. Professor STERNBERG is an Ellis Barnard Fellow and Associate Professor of Early Modern History, who has previously studied and held positions at Tel-Aviv University and the Harvard Society of Fellows, where he served as a junior fellow from 2009 to 2012. His first book in 2014 was titled Status Interaction During the Reign of Louis XIV. And in 2016, it was shortlisted for the Royal History Society Gladstone Prize. He's also written several articles from 2006 to 2020 on subjects such as dress and status under Louis XIV, the Beaufort-Montvillar incident, ceremonial strategies and their manipulation in the Ancien regime, and issues of lordly priority in early modern France. His current research project is entitled Writing Acts, The Power of Writing in the Ancien regime, which looks at the impact of manuscripts in social and political arenas, the first stages of which were published in 2013 in the Journal of Modern History. His research interests focus primarily on the intersections of political, social, and cultural history in early modern Europe, and especially symbolic interaction and writing practices within the field. Professor STERNBERG, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much, and really for this opportunity to engage with so many of you. I'm really excited about it, so I thought I might just say a few words about the focus is on status interaction, and so I wanted to talk about the rationale behind that project. And also the way that it connects to some of my more recent work, as discussed on writing practices and so forth. I'm very happy to talk about both. I guess contrary to some misimpressions, the object of inquiry in my book is not the court of Louis XIV. Rather, it is the phenomenon of status interaction. So that was sort of the central issue for me. And so this is sort of a term by which I mean the ways that social status was signified, negotiated, and contested in interpersonal interaction. Now, the Court Society of Louis XIV was chosen as the setting for this project for, I think, two primary reasons. Well, one is that it is one of the most famous historical arenas of this phenomenon. I think people who know about the court of Louis XIV have sort of thought about questions of its intricate hierarchies and questions of status there. Another thing is that it has left a wealth of evidence, both sort of quantitatively and qualitatively, for investigating a phenomenon that is actually quite elusive and difficult to reconstruct at historical distance. So it provides a solid enough basis for what is actually a historical ethnography. But unlike anthropologists, I can't sort of directly observe these sort of status interactions. So the kinds of source basis that we have on the court of Louis XIV really enables us to use that as sort of a case study for the phenomenon. But what I'd like to argue is that this is actually a phenomenon that transcends this specific arena, or indeed this period. If in reading the book, modern analogies have occurred to you, I think that's not accidental. I mean, take for example the Affaire des Sièges, which I discuss in chapter 2 about the sort of hierarchy of seats and types of seats and so forth. And I wonder if you think about the corporate armchair that we find in the offices of CEOs of the 21st century, is that not the modern equivalent of signifying hierarchy by seat type? And certainly if we look at the early modern period, status interaction was a pervasive phenomenon. The book points to various analogies from contemporary social and geographical settings, including from the French provinces to the Holy Roman Empire, for example. And in my recent research, this has just further confirmed this this hunch that if we look at the phenomenon, it extends to arenas where we perhaps wouldn't have expected to find it. I'm happy to talk more in discussion about this. So the obvious question perhaps to ask is, why have historians tended to neglect this phenomenon? I think part of the answer lies in the challenges of Reconstruction, which I touched on earlier. But there's also a deeper reason. While social hierarchy and status symbols are still with us, there is now also, I think, a greater moral ambiguity, which has led to the marginalization, sometimes even trivialization of the phenomenon. I mean, many people perhaps ask themselves, I mean, seriously, can they really have argued about the length of a piece of clothing? Now, I guess from a moral perspective or personal perspective, I share this sort of feeling of ambiguity when I look at these early modern actors. But analytically speaking, applying these kinds of modern prisms, I think, risks missing what was significant for contemporaries. So in the same way that historians living in a more secularized age have in recent decades nonetheless been working to bring religion back, right? It's one of the things that we find in a variety of early modern settings about the importance of understanding the importance of religion to phenomena, even sort of wars of religion where it has been sidelined in many of the discussions in favor of a more political prism, for example. So this sort of need to bring back the early modern perspectives and priorities in order to understand the period better. I think the same is required in the investigation of status interaction throughout the early modern world. And I think the outcome of this kind of investigation is to regain an important key to early modern agency, one that illuminates both the priorities of early modern people and in the process, also other major historical questions which are re-illuminated as a result. In this book, for example, it's about the politics of the French state. I think one of the central insights is that status interaction shaped as well as reflected social identities and political power. It's not just a reflection, a mirror of other things. And part of the reason for that is that even in a context like the court of Louis XIV, again, contrary to perhaps some conceptions or impressions, status and hierarchy were not positively codified. There were not rules that dictated each and every aspect of this, but rather status interactions were determined on the ground, according to custom, according to precedent, and often through contestation. So this is sort of the overall picture, I think, of rationale. And methodologically speaking, looking at the way that I have reconstructed this phenomenon, the book looks at status codes in a spectrum of contexts, ranging from public high ceremonies, such as royal funerals, to everyday rituals, and awards special attention to the communicational and material dimension of status codes in the interactions between persons, but also between persons and objects, clothing, chairs, etc. So in sort of running through the structure of the book, the first two chapters look at a dynastic marriage at the highest level between the French and the Spanish courts in 1679, with the first chapter showcasing the series of status codes, and the second zooming in on a particular one, the typology of seats that I mentioned earlier. The next couple of chapters systematically examine over a longer period the status codes involving a key dress item of the early modern period, the mantles, both in high ceremonies, but also in interpersonal interactions. The next chapter, chapter 5, revisits one of the most celebrated aspects of daily ritual at the French court, the handing of the shirt, the chemise, or the napkin and serviette, which happened on a daily basis in the French court, but also in other settings across early modern Europe. And finally, the last chapter interrogates an even more everyday practice. So kind of moving along this spectrum, it looks at correspondence and shows how letters acted as a vehicle of status, not just in things such as forms of address, but also in subtler aspects of word choice, and even, I think, perhaps most surprisingly, in material and spatial dimensions of the letter. So the organization of items on the page or the materiality of the letter itself. And this case of correspondence reminds us that written documents, which are, of course, one of the most important types of historical sources, were not generated for the benefit of us historians. right? But rather to address contemporary aims, issues, and purposes. And they did so in their material form as well as in their textual content. So recovering the original logic and functions of writings, whether in the case of status interaction or for other purposes, has been a central preoccupation of mine, and as noted in the introduction, is the focus of my current work on writing acts in the ancien regime. And I'd be happy to talk about this sort of ongoing research as well as the book. So I guess this is probably the point to open the floor to you, and I very much look forward to the questions, discussions, and conversations.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Professor. So I think I'd like to start with that, if it's all right, with a fairly broad question just to kind of introduce the topic.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand where you're coming from with regards to the fact that, you know, looking from a more perhaps egalitarian society, I think nowadays where we tend to reject a lot of the pomp and circumstance of nobility, I think it's very easy for us to sort of look back and think of these things as almost a little bit ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it would perhaps be best to start off with just sort of asking, why was this really important? Like, why were these sort of rituals and ceremonies and the sort of proper way to interact with people so vital for kind of people of status, not just in sort of early modern France, but in many other contexts besides?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And a point which I think I'd like to emphasize, and again, it comes out more in my current work. I sort of mentioned it as briefly in the book, is that it's not just for people what we would think of perhaps as people of status. I mean, to an extent, yes, but it extends to people of status in a very local context. So it's not just the courts, international politics. But in sort of more recent years, I've been doing research in, you know, sort of municipal contexts, looking at in departmental archives, at the proceedings of people in sort of local towns, academics also, well, maybe that's less surprising, but also merchants and so forth. And these sort of preoccupations can be found on a variety of levels. And I think part of that has to do in the fact that for these people, hierarchy was a much more natural and obvious part of their world, and something that was not something to be ashamed of or to be avoided in the same way that some of our more sort of egalitarian notions perhaps would lead us today. And another, I think, important thing that even as I know, even in the court of Louis XIV, these hierarchies were much more fluid than we'd like to think. They weren't rigid, and they were determined in part through these sorts of interactions. So what defined the social identity and the status of a person was what they did, not just who they were, in the sense of, you know, being a prince or a duke and so forth. And in a way, the positions on the social ladder were constantly being renegotiated in action. Because both hierarchies and status codes were much more fluid than we like to think, it meant that they could be contested, and that there was room for, you know, by standing in a particular way, or sitting or dressing in a particular way, you could make a point, and if that point was not immediately contested or stopped by others, you'd actually make a move, and therefore move up or sometimes down the ladder if you didn't react.
It's really interesting. Thank you very much. We have a question from Joao next, and I think one from our audience as well. Joao?
Your study is probably the first study to address social status of Louis XIV's court as a key tool for defining identities and relations about the members of the court. Which are the characters that you studied that can best demonstrate that relation, and what were their backgrounds and contexts that can demonstrate us what the question about status?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, one thing which I'd like to, I'm not the first, obviously, to think about that. I mean, in a way, I think perhaps the kind of seminal study was the work of Norbert Elias on the court society. So he was a sociologist who sort of wrote a very, very important work on, and I think he was the first to realize the importance of status. But I mean, I can talk about the sort of various problems in Elias if people are interested, or I just refer to the introduction to the book, and especially in chapter 5. So just to sort of give credit where credit is due, and there obviously are others who have worked on it. But I think perhaps in sort of positing that phenomenon as central and reconstructing its codes, I think, yeah, I guess in that way, this is well, an important intervention, I guess, in that field. And in answer to your question, so perhaps the group that illustrates in the most dramatic way these, and also connecting that to the previous question, the sort of plasticity of status and the way that one can use these interactions to promote change and actually to feed into macro politics of the French state. I think the most interesting group here is the legitimated princes. So these were the bastard sons of Louis XIV. And also of previous kings, right? So these are people whose status, precisely because their status was not, they didn't have like a clear position in the social ladder, they would have to create it. And the way for them to create that status, I argue, was to a large extent thanks to these various social interactions. So, well, the sort of bastards of the king at birth were sort of even below just any other subject because of the way that early modern society viewed legitimacy and marriage in this particular context. And what we can see throughout so from birth in the sort of 1660s and 1670s, and from being the sort of even below like your usual subject, they reached a point in 1714 when they are promoted, not only recognized as princes, but actually promoted into the line of succession. So they become eligible to inherit the throne at a point where the demography of the Bourbon dynasty was such that there were sort of very few legitimate people in line. So they got quite close. And I argue that although the sort of dynastic situation was part of what, obviously the context for why that happened in 1714, this could not have happened without decades of their acting the role. And they're in a gradual process, and we can see that in the documentation, that begins in a surreptitious way. So even Louis XIV, and that's another interesting point, right? We think of Louis XIV as this sort of powerful figure who in 1714 integrated them into the line of succession against everyone. But if we look at Louis XIV of 1675, he writes a letter to his minister Colbert, where he asks him to ensure that his bastard sons get the same kind of status as the kind of lower rank of Bourbon princes. But he makes the point that this should be done all so that it looks naturally, and also to make sure that perhaps what would stand out as the most radical measure, the fact that they would give the shirt to the Dauphin, right? Because that's another very important status code. That's probably not something that he wants at this particular point. So you should sort of take him out of the room at that point, so that doesn't show. And then in subsequent years, they do give the shirt to the Dauphin, and thus get integrated into the sort of lower rungs of the Bourbon dynasty. And then you can see the process in the 1690s, 1710s, and so forth, how they gradually, through doing things, through these status interactions, gradually usurp, as their perhaps rivals would say, the status symbols of Bourbon princes. And therefore, at the moment in 1714, when they become full Bourbon princes with a right to inherit the throne, they've been acting the part for many years now, which makes it conceivable for a king who would not even sort of integrate them fully in the 1670s to go all the way. in 1714.
And now from our audience, can we talk about networks of sociability in court of Louis XIV?
Sociability in the sense of well, there are all kinds of sociability in the way that they interact with status, or more broadly, or I mean, I guess they're all well. I guess sociability is
probably we can adjust that with another question from our audience. What kind of relationships were established between the aristocracy for the maintenance of power?
What kind of
relationship were established between the aristocracy for the maintenance of power?
Well, yeah, I think these are interesting questions. In a way, yes, these networks, this relates to networks of sociability as well. And I think, I mean, one of the interesting things so the traditional view of Louis XIV and his period is just, the king who's controlling the court and the state, and the aristocracy, which just becomes drawn into this gilded cage of Versailles. And I think one of the interesting things about the historiography, the broader historiography of the period, and in that sense, this sort of study of status is part of a broader move away from that kind of Louis IV centrism, if you like, by realizing that the broader aristocracy continued to be quite important in all kinds of ways. And it's precisely by moving away from the kind of traditional understanding of politics and power as residing in sort of official councils and in sort of formal decision-making processes, in whether or not you have a seat in the government, so to speak, or a position as a minister, to looking at these sort of more informal aspects of networks, of sociability, of patronage, which is another sort of key aspect that historians have looked at, and to understand the court not as a cage, but rather as a key stage, as a marketplace for power and prestige, where these sort of powerful aristocrats would meet, would conduct business, right, including marriages, which for them, in the same way that you find in the corporate world, perhaps, were part of how they would maintain their power, enhance their power, exchange favors, and so forth. And by virtue of the kinds of positions that they would obtain at court, would then be able to influence wider networks in the provinces. Because again, one of the things is that each of these aristocrats had a foothold both in the center and in the provinces because of their provincial holdings, sometimes provincial positions, and there were levels of patronage running from the center all the way down to local provincial centers and provincial towns, and obtaining a position in a small administrative unit up to a position in the high courts of the Parliament and so forth was also linked to these networks, and status was one of the ways by which they both competed but also worked together. And I think another interesting thing is the way that is to think about this from a corporate perspective, both in terms of looking at family and kinship networks, or people in the same kinds of positions, whether in terms of their position at court or of their offices, right? If members of a court of law are members of municipality, and the way that they acted corporately in order to obtain collective objectives, and not just fighting against one another.
Fantastic, thank you very much. It's really interested to hear some of the things you said about how there are lots of different channels and lots of different networks that could be tapped into that often, I think, almost tend to be invisible, for lack of a better word, in the sense that they're not perhaps part of the official court structure, but they still have a role to play. And so I'd like to ask in line of that, are there any particular kind of groups or people that tend to get overlooked in the study of this discipline that you feel that, you know, are important, but perhaps haven't had necessarily the attention that they deserve?
Well, I mean, I think it's more about sort of maybe a more global attention sometimes. I mean, in the specific context of well, from the specific perspective of status, I think it's often associated with the court rather than with other levels. And of course, obviously, especially if you look at French historians who have studied various groups on all kinds of levels, from the center to the smallest towns. But I think one of the problems sometimes is when these studies tend to be fragmented. So people look at a particular question from the perspective of, you know, the town that they're looking at or the corporation that they're studying, and this has often prevented a more unified framework. So I guess part of what I was trying to do in the book is provide a kind of a perhaps model for a framework studied in from a particular context, of course, but that I think can be further developed. And part of what I'm doing in the second project, although from a different perspective, is to look at how these questions were also relevant throughout you know, throughout France, throughout the Ancien Regime, and to an extent in other periods as well. So it's, I guess it's about integration, and it depends also on the question, right? Because there are questions that have been investigated better in the context of the center, other questions that have been looked at from a cross section, say looking at, historians have looked at, well, municipalities, as I've mentioned, have looked at courts of law. I mean, another important element is the sort of the parlement in this period, which has been investigated both as a corporate element, but also in particular contexts. Yeah, so I guess it's a question of in which particular themes, and well, thankfully there are always you know, niches and elements that have not been studied before, or at least there are sort of fresh ways of looking at it. Yeah.
It's really interesting to know. Thank you very much. I think we have another question now from our audience. Joao, if you want to ask that.
Well, no, we haven't.
Oh,
yes, sorry. It was the the second one that I say.
Oh, right. Okay. Okay, no worries. I'll carry on then. Brilliant, yeah. So I suppose sort of moving the conversation ahead then, I'd love to learn a bit more about the project that you're currently involved in. As I can imagine that thinking about the subject from the perspective of correspondence rather than perhaps say physical interaction, I imagine has slightly different considerations and disciplines as well. So yeah, how does that compare to perhaps studying kind of spatial ceremony? And yeah, what have been your key findings from that so far?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess, I mean, perhaps begins by starting about correspondence, which is what I've looked at already in the first book and in some of my subsequent articles as well. So I think yeah, I think so pointing out correspondence as opposed to the others is really key, because one of the great things from a methodological perspective, I think, is that actually with correspondence, if we think of correspondence not as just a source of information, right, as something that we extract knowledge of, but as an object of interaction, it's actually possible for historians to have to directly observe, right? Because if we think about the use of a form of address as a particular move that the letter writer made in writing to the addressee, or also, as I mentioned, you know, the kinds of spaces, because you know the blank space on the page between the form of address, the monsieur, for example, and where they began the text, also denoted their understanding of the relative status relations between between writer and addressee. So in that context, when we hold a 17th century letter in our hands, which fortunately we can in the archives, we're actually observing a status interaction as it was in the early modern period. It's sort of in the same way, assuming that the document has survived intact. And that opens up a range of possibilities, because it's both direct observation, and also they tend to survive much better. Obviously, physical interactions do not survive apart from in sort of representations, and even the objects, such as the seats or the items of clothing, usually do not survive in their original form, or at least not to a great extent. Whereas correspondence, by the 17th century, survives quite well, not equally well. So again, going back to your previous questions, obviously there are lots of things that we'd like to know about social groups who haven't left, either have not written in the first place, or haven't, or whose writings were not preserved to the same extent. But still, by the 17th century, we have a fair amount of writings that have been preserved for a broader section of the society. So we can actually even think about quantitative questions, not obviously in the same sort of perfect way that we'd like, but we can actually sort of just count, look at forms of address, see what percentages, see how they change on a relatively frequent basis. If we have series of correspondence that are conserved in certain archives, or a correspondence between a certain family that we have over time, so that opens a lot of possibilities. In the next project, I look at two types of writing acts. So the project focuses on two types of writing acts, not including correspondence, by the way. So I think correspondence is actually an excellent demonstration of a writing act, precisely in that way, that sort of you make a clear position and you're making a move, and if that move is not countered, it actually has a bearing on a social identity. But so in this project, I focus on two types of writings in particular. One which builds on the first project, is looking at ceremonial records. But here, not ceremonial records of the court, or not just, but rather primarily, as I mentioned, looking at how ceremonial records functioned across the Ancien Regime. So from sort of mid-17th century, and I extend it to the end of the Ancien Regime. So looking at municipalities, merchants, local courts, universities, and so forth. And so one thing, just the fact that we can see these ceremonial records operating in quite strikingly similar ways to the way that they function in the royal court is, I think, quite significant, and sort of supports the argument about the broad pervasiveness and significance of the phenomenon. But in the book, I'm interested, in the book in progress, I'm interested more. I'm focused more in how ceremonial writings as ceremonial records as writing practices, because in the same way that custom and precedent determined, rather than any sort of positive law and saying, okay, you have to do this in this particular way. Rather, the way that it works is if you establish that you did that last time and the time before, and so forth, this can shape, and actually will shape, the way that you're going to do it next time. And what happens in the course of the early modern period, as writing becomes much more pervasive and is used as a tool for establishing and recording, what happens is that the written record becomes at least as, if not more important than what actually happened, right? So, so people record these ceremonies, and the next time when they want to know what happened last time, they're going to consult the written record. And because they're aware of that, the written record becomes a stake in itself and an object of contestation and manipulation as well. And we see people fighting over, after the ceremony, after the event, about how it's going to be recorded, and trying to get things either in or out sometimes of the record. And we see the record sometimes being rewritten. We find interesting erasures, additions, and so forth. So by writing the past, you're shaping the future. So that's one part of the project. And the other part of the project focuses on a very interesting and neglected piece of genre of writing in the early modern period, which is called protestation. I mean, in the French context, protestation. So if ceremonial records shape the future by writing what happened in the past, a protestation sought to undo the past or the present in the future. So there were all kinds, and I can talk more about that if people are interested. But perhaps the sort of paradigmatic scenario of a protestation would be someone who was forced to do something against their will by coercion. And that happens in a variety of contexts. I mean, just to give one example, say people who are forced to renounce a succession, or people who are forced by their parents into monastic vows. That's something that happened in the early modern period, where sons or daughters were made to. I mean, it didn't happen all the time, but it did happen when they were forced to into monasteries and convents, and because they had to take monastic vows, which you couldn't be released of unless there was a very clear case. What they did was they would produce a document just before and immediately after taking vows, establishing that they were taking those vows against their will. So by producing a document, you use that in the future in order to undo what you couldn't do otherwise. So, and what's interesting about protestations is the very wide types of usages and aims that they served. So again, from these sort of local familial contexts to international politics, where we find protestations taken by those who were forced either through sort of military or sort of multilateral treaties and so forth to act against their will, or who were protesting against what others did, which they couldn't counteract immediately, but they needed to establish the fact that they protested and that they will move to undo that in the future. So I think this opens a mode of resistance that has been neglected in the historiography of the early modern period.
Thank you very much for that. That's it sounds like such a fantastic project in terms of its scope and size, and I think it's extraordinary. Just, I suppose, almost the variety of documents and almost how they can have as much status, just sort of based on the fact that obviously they're a written record. And I imagine there's something like writing as well. It's as much about what's omitted as much as what's included as well. That's a really extraordinary source. Yeah, I mean, I suppose if you don't mind me asking, what do you think it is that sort of makes writing so powerful in these sorts of contexts? Is it the fact that it's a sort of permanent record and it's something that people will then use to kind of consolidate memory as almost a kind of sort of visible, tangible thing? Or is there sort of more to it than that?
Well, I mean, certainly that's a very important thing, right? And historians have sort of looked at the way that writing has evolved. And I mean, one key work is the medieval historians Clanchy's work on From Memory to Written Record, who looked at England in the medieval period and the way that writing increasingly becomes, right? Because in earlier societies, they were primarily oral, and in a way, even societies with writing, the kinds of face-to-face interaction was often considered more central, or sometimes objects, but not necessarily writings. And what's interesting is how in the course of a long period of time from the Middle Ages, but we see that so writing becomes increasingly more important. Customary law moves from sort of oral practices to a written codification and so forth. And of course, it's the permanence of the written record that gives it a lot of power and enables precisely people to act over a long period of time. For example, in the case of ceremonial records, it can go back, beyond memory, or at least it can establish things in perhaps in ways that were more difficult earlier. And it's also possible to date and verify things in a way that, or because of course in oral societies, transmission can be quite, surprisingly, can work surprisingly well through mnemonic practices and so forth. But with writing, you can actually establish, was that written at the time or not in various ways. So that's another perhaps way by which a record has sort of advantages over other types of media. And yeah, so this ability to record and to keep a record is important. What I think is quite interesting about writing as well is, as I noted, the kind of material aspects of it, and the way that sometimes, so it's a combination of both a textual and a material culture that makes writing what it is, right? So with writing, you can establish authority in various ways. And I think that's also something that's quite central to the project in looking at, so these protestations, for example, are sometimes written by private individuals, but one of the sort of key people who produce these are notaries, right? These kinds of professionals who are extremely important in the early modern period, and who both were sort of gave written shape to claims and transactions, but also gave them authority, right? Because they acted as sort of stamps of truth and authority, and so the same kind of document that was produced, the same writing that was produced by an individual, or that carried the stamp of a notary in the way that it was produced and had his signature at the end, would have a different kind of power. And so it's quite interesting to see how, so it's both these kinds of maybe qualities that are more inherent to the difference of the medium, but also the kind of quasi-magical, in the same way that certain perhaps oral performances have greater power because they're performed in a particular way or in a particular space. Writings also have that kind of magical transformation due to a signature, the use of a particular type of surface, right? Parchment as opposed to paper, having a seal, and so forth.
Fantastic. That's really interesting. Thank you very much. And it's yeah, I do see what you mean. It's extraordinary how almost as soon as something's written down and turned into a record, suddenly it takes on this extraordinary new power of its own. That's really interesting. Thank you. I'm going to hand over to João now, as I think we have a few more questions from him and our audience. João.
So this one is quite embracing, but what is the role of the court in the power games between aristocracy and king?
Aristocracy and
the king.
And the king. So the court, as in the royal court.
Yes, I believe so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah. So this has obviously been part of a key element, and also the change in the historiography. So the kind of traditional image, which was actually propagated by Elias, right? So I mentioned Norbert Elias. In a way, his work was very much drawn on the sort of traditional view of the court as the kind of setting for the monarch to domesticate the aristocracy, right? So as this kind of golden cage where the kinds of magnates who in the past controlled vast territories and had independent armies and so forth are brought into this court and being domesticated through status symbols and loss of autonomy, are then subjugated in that way. But I think one of the interesting things about the way that the historiography has changed is by understanding the court as this sort of setting where the aristocracy interacts with the king and interacts amongst itself. So it's not just about controlling from the king's position, but about gaining power in various ways, whether, as I mentioned, in finding contracting a marriage, or in creating connections with the more formal aspects, right? Because one of the interesting things about the court is precisely that in the early modern period, it's both the setting of these sort of informal sociability and networks that we've been talking about earlier, but is also the seat of government, right? It's also the place where the ministers are doing their work. And therefore, these these aristocrats who control the daily rituals of the king, for example, the first gentlemen of the bedchamber, who interact with him on a regular basis and control who actually can enter the room at a particular point. Therefore, can influence whether a minister has access or whether others wishing to talk to the king can enter and can have that sort of quality time at a key moment. So the court. Well, of course, the court can be defined in all kinds of ways, but it is a space, and in the period of Louis XIV, of course, it becomes sedentary, not completely sedentary, but it sort of establishes itself in Versailles, where it will remain with sort of some occasional moves and some seasonal moves to other courts, but into a particular space where both government, in the formal sense, is transacted, but also we have these informal interactions. And these aristocrats, also, I guess, it depends what you mean by aristocrats. That's another perhaps dimension of the question, because there are these sort of traditional sword aristocrats, these kinds of dukes, princes, and so forth, whose status derives from their sort of ancestry, from their positions in the military and so forth. But there's also an aristocracy that becomes increasingly important in the course of the early modern period, the so-called nobility of the robe and aristocracy of the robe, where people, both the ministers, but even more so, the members of the Parlement, for example. So the French Parlement are sort of courts of law. They're not exactly parliament in the sort of British sense, but they're courts of law they're high courts of law that have a role in legislation as well. And these are quite important, established quite important dynasties too. Though they are slightly less involved in the court in Versailles. And in that sense, the older aristocracy establishes a hold through its positions at the court. I mean, one of the sort of key works on that is on court positions, right? The kinds of various positions such as gentleman of the bedchamber, or Grand Chamberlain, Grand Master of the household, and so on, because they're involved with the day-to-day life of the king, and they control thousands of positions, by which way they're able to function in these sort of systems of patronage that I alluded to earlier. So the court is certainly a very central space for understanding the aristocracy's interaction with the king.
So this one is a little bit different. I would like to know about the main points of your methodology and about the obstacles that you have found.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess for the first project, as I said, it's a sort of a historical anthropology or ethnology, right? Because we're actually trying to understand codes of behavior, of interaction, which, with the exception of correspondence, as we discussed earlier, are quite actually difficult to gauge, right? If we want to understand both what happened and how people perceived it, right? Because these codes can be likened to language in a way, right? There's a logic to it, which you need to reconstruct, and they're not as self-evident as you might think. I mean, think about our own life, the kinds of implicit codes of how we interact with people, the kinds of cues that we send by the way that we dress or the positions that we take in a situation, or where we sit and so forth. So kind of finding the sources for that has been one of the the key challenges. So historians have sort of talked about that and have devised all kinds of strategies for it, but it's still quite a challenge. I think many previous studies have relied on a rather limited set of sources, either the sort of famous memoirs or journals of those who participated and described. I mean, the most famous source that Elias and many others have drawn on are the memoirs of the Duke of Saint-Simon, right? So these are quite helpful because it gives us an insight of how insiders, so to speak, understood these interactions and often documented them. But it's not enough, right? Because there aren't many of those that are systematic, and they sometimes give us only a partial perspective. Another type of source that historians have used in order to understand these sorts of codes was looking at sort of prescriptive documents, things like manuals, kind of etiquette books and so forth. And these again are quite helpful because they're systematic, right? They give us a sense of how to of at least the kinds of things that might have mattered, what types of interactions, what types of objects, and so forth. But they're also limited. I mean, when was the last time that you opened? There still are etiquette manuals, of course, nowadays. And I mean, when was the last time they actually did you ever open an etiquette manual and sort of thinking how to, interact with your friends or write a letter? Maybe once in a very formal situation, but probably not very often. So the prescription is not the same as practice, and kind of looking for practice is something that's quite challenging. And in the context of the French court in particular, also it has proven quite challenging because after the revolution, right? The revolution actually was quite against these systems of status and hierarchy, and they sometimes actually destroyed the sources, both specific to these issues or more generally, right? The sort of ancien regime aspects, especially those that relate to court society. So we don't always have the kinds of sources that even existed at the time when these matters were somehow discussed. And this is perhaps one of the reasons why I find writing so useful. But again, not just as and that's again, I think, an important methodological element of my work. So not just as a description of the past, where you just extract information, but thinking about writing, which is perhaps one of the most abundant objects that have survived from this period. And we can use and think about how these documents, whether correspondence or a register or a notarial act, right? What did contemporaries actually try to achieve by producing that document? And you actually hold the document in your own hands, so you can examine it, you can think about its materiality. And here again, this is a broader, I think, a move in the historiography of the past couple of decades or so, in thinking about the materiality of texts and the way that these have a bearing on understanding them in the early modern context, and again, not just as lenses for us as historians.
Fantastic, thank you very much for that. One thing which I'll be interested to kind of know about now that we've sort of familiarized ourselves a bit more with the topic is obviously one thing about Louis XIV is that it was a court where I suppose we traditionally associated it having lots of kind of formal ceremony, pomp and splendor, and things like that. When sort of you study status and interaction within these sort of contexts, is it normally easier for people to find status and move up and down in arenas where sort of ceremony is very visible and very prominent, or does it not really have much of a bearing?
No, that's a very good question. I mean, I think, as I mentioned, part of what I've tried to do was to look at a ceremonial spectrum that kind of moves from these sort of really high ceremonies to much more everyday interactions. And so I think while they're sort of equally useful for understanding, there are important differences, as you sort of note, right? Because obviously, the more people attend these events, or the more important these events or arenas are, the more sort of stakes there are in that, and so there's sort of a difference between these events such as coronations, funerals, weddings, and so forth, which happen only every so often and involve a wide attendance, and these more sort of day-to-day interactions. Well, first of all, you have many more witnesses, so it's much more difficult to sort of establish something afterwards against what actually happened. So and also because for these sort of everyday interactions, such as, well, either letter writings or these day-to-day visits, because visits were also occasions where status was established. So I think this question of memory that we talked about earlier was more important in these high events which happened only every so often. So on the one hand, there were more people who observed them and therefore could immediately remember them. But on the other hand, if they happened quite rarely, then you had to have a record to actually extract what happened. Say, think about coronation, right? So Louis XIV had his coronation in the 1650s, and the next coronation happened in the 1720s, right? So there were very few people who lived at both times and could actually make a record of that. Talk about that. So I think these large events are a sort of a function of how many people are attending, which are attending, but still these day-to-day interactions were also quite important. These sort of visits where people would see one another also had a quite and you could sort of cumulatively sometimes gain more precisely because these interactions happened with a slightly with a smaller type of audience, and you could sort of make a point and then gradually establish your right through these less formal, or at least less visible types of interaction.
I see. It's interesting in the sense that I suppose in a larger setting, obviously there's much more kind of form and precedence and things, and then there needs to be a sort of formal record. Whereas I suppose in smaller ones, it's much easier to kind of move up and, I don't know, perhaps change the way that you did things before and just be a lot more kind of fluid in the way that you interacted with that particular space.
Yeah, exactly. Though sometimes, because the last time was so long ago, you actually don't have a record for it, or because if you actually manage to manipulate the record after the fact, and there are cases where they actually revisit a ceremony 40 years after it actually happened. I mean, in that article that you mentioned in the Journal of Modern History, there's an episode where, interestingly, actually they spot something on a tapestry. So sort of visual media also play into it as a form of record. But they spot something on a tapestry, they revisit the ceremonial record, and they introduce a correction to it 40 years after the fact. So it's never too late to make a change, even for a sort of ceremony that happened and was attended by many people.
Absolutely, never too late to kind of cement your position in the hierarchy. Fantastic. Well, unfortunately, that's all that we have time for this evening. More's the pity as well, as it's been a really fascinating discussion. But I'd like to thank Professor Sternberg for his time this evening. It's been a really fantastic conversation. And I'd like to thank our audience as well. Thank you very much for tuning in as well. We hope that you'll join us in the next episode. So thank you very much, and take care and have a good evening.